Good evening. I'm John Lebo. I'm the chair of the Lake Forest Park City Council Budget and Finance Committee meeting, and we have a quorum this evening. So with that, the first order of business is to adopt the agenda. Do I hear a motion?
Motion.
Yeah. Second, all those in favor of adopting the agenda, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. No, any opposed? Hearing none, the agenda is adopted. That brings us to public comments. Do we have any persons who would like to speak this evening?
No.
No, so that will move us from public comments to our director's report from our Director of Business and Finance.
Finance.
So I'd like to recognize Director Vaughn.
So we will be putting up the dashboard, and which will walk us into our conversation of going over, like we do almost every budget and finance committee meeting. Just walking down the ones that are on the yellow, which then we're going to talk about these a couple times tonight because of the budget amendment that is being scheduled. So walking down the civil service, that's because the police department has been doing hiring. That is tied directly to that. So that's why that is a little bit on the higher side. The detention and jail costs for now the past couple years have been significantly higher than they have been historically. And so that's another item that we've been talking about for a while, and we need to amend, and we'll be on the amendment. The environmental services, that's actually animal control. And that's on the amendment to be adjusted. We had last year, 2023 was an unusually high expense year for animal control. For a couple months there in late summer, early fall. Walking down to municipal services, that's right on the line, not something I'm concerned about. And one of the main drivers on that is they pay for insurance, which is an annual cost in there. But that's literally 66.7 and 67% right on the line. So even though it's triggering, I'm not concerned about that one. The parks is up because of seasonals. And then walking down to the surface water utility, that has been increased because there's some operations, permitting, that expenses that are coming in a little bit higher, and have been. Also I'll wait and say that during the budget amendment. So then, are there any questions or keep walking?
Just a thought on the park. So do we anticipate the seasonals will bring us over, but then as we move into the late fall, winter, that or do we still see ourselves at the end being a little bit over? What's our anticipation?
We're amending. Because currently right now, I think we have 4 seasonals in addition, because there's a couple actual maintenance positions that have not been filled, and they're helping keep everything. So those positions are posted, but right now, previously we weren't able to actually secure seasonals, but the pay scale was adjusted, and so that's part of what we're amending to, because what we put in our original budget is not the actual cost of what the city is incurring. Keep going. We're good. Okay, so then going down to the ARPA, that is for what has been allocated at 93%. There will be more discussion around that during the budget amendment. And then walking down to the emergency management, that is an annual expense. Not as concerned about that one. Memberships, the city this year elected to be a part of the National League of Cities. So we'll get that amended. And then just a reminder, walking over to the revenue by fund, that the transportation capital, that one is low, based on the fact that it was so heavily grant supported from the Transportation Improvement Board and, the WASDOT grant that are tied to the roundabout project. So, and those are reimbursable grants. So until you expend those dollars, the revenue will not be showing up on the revenue side. And so then walking down to the capital side, there is not a ton of activity on the capital, but the one thing I do want to highlight right now is currently the asphalt, the overlay program is taking place for the next 2 to 3 weeks. And so that we're playing a little bit of catch up on that. And I think that is going to walk me to the back side of the agenda, or the dashboard, excuse me. What document are we on? Just kidding. So business tax, the revenue by line item, business tax is coming in on target. The construction permits, I'm just going to make a comment on those between construction permits and mechanical and plumbing permits, that those are coming in incredibly strong right now. And Calvin keeps commenting how he just can't believe how much activity, and normally it's seasonal, but this year we've really been quite active on the construction permitting front this entire year, which is, so that trend from the pandemic is still holding strong. And then the gas tax, that's coming in at about 65%. Passport revenue, we did just make that transition of adding the additional, plus adding the additional. So that will be bringing in more revenue. And so we will start seeing that change probably as soon as May. So those numbers, that's going to also be on the budget amendment like we discussed. So the real estate excise tax 1 and 2, that's coming in at 56%, a little under, but we are kind of going into more of that season. That is definitely one we're watching. I just don't know how else to say it. It's one that we're very aware of, watching, and so I don't have a whole lot more to say about that. The sales and use tax is coming in just above at 68%, and the traffic safety camera revenue is also coming in slightly above target. That concludes my report.
Thank you. Just for the benefit, on the non-operating departments under lakefront property, if you can just explain that for the benefit.
Oh, the non,
Yeah, the 1.1 million.
we're gonna talk about that during the budget amendment. Would you prefer to do it
We can do
there, here?
We
Basically,
can wait for the budget.
we're gonna, okay. Cause you can see it on both sides, the revenue and the expenditure, which might make more sense. Because it's a grant, it's the RCO grant plus the expenditure of the interfund loan, which we're gonna amend to take care of the housekeeping that needs to be done.
I'm patient. I can wait.
There's a preview, so we will discuss that.
Are there any other questions? With that, then, our next line item is old business. Not seen any old business. That brings us down to new business. And the first one is the purchasing policy. And I will again look to Director Vaughn to walk us through it.
So the purchasing policy, this is definitely still in draft form. We so kindly took this policy from another city because we do not need to reinvent the wheel. We are, but then any time that a city or an entity does that, you still need to make sure it fits your city. And what you reasonably are going to be able to do, because once you adopt a policy, then you are tied to what is within the policy when on an accountability audit. So we definitely still need to make sure that what's in the policy is what reasonably feasibly, a city our size can manageably, do. So
So-
this,
Before you go too far,
Mhm.
sorry to interrupt. It might be useful to give us a background as to the impetus for adopting a new policy.
so the city has two resolutions currently that are stated at the top of this, that's within the packet, resolution 617 and resolution 1399. And both of those are very minimal on what they state in those policies. And so this becomes a more holistic working document, more so for staff to use and refer back to, and in order to have clearer guidelines. The guidelines are set by, like, the thresholds are set of what triggers by the revised code of Washington, RCWs, and WACs, and Washington Administrative Code. Of course, I'm gonna not know what that one is. I'm gonna say, I think it's in here, Washington Administrative Code. Okay. And so the city does have a couple of those in place, but it is time to adopt a more robust policy. And so the city is gonna be honest here, we've started this, I want to say, about a year ago. And due to demands that continue to just come up, it hasn't quite made it across the finish line, because that's the challenge of a small city. That being said, there is a change being driven currently by state law that the thresholds are changing. And those changes are coming, and they are effective on July 1st. So with that being said, we wanted to make sure that you guys had the draft policy in hand. And then the intent is to come back with Kim, who's been our city attorney, who's been very involved in drafting and modifying this policy, at more of a work session for more of a back and forth discussion, a little less formal than council meeting, with the intent to have it adopted prior to July 1st. So I'm bringing it forward to make sure that you guys have the policy in hand. You can write down, draft any questions you have, and so that we can get them answered.
Can we get the 617 and 1399?
Oh.
So we can. That is.
Absolutely.
So how much of this is based off of the other codes? Like, how much of this do we have to do in that form, and how much of it is what
So the main things,
we can?
yeah, so I probably could include something like this, where it's just basically your code cities. Your purchasing bid limits are the main driving factor of what's changing, and a code city under 20, population 20,000, the small purchase quotes was 7,500. So now that's changing to 40,000. They're drastically changing. And so the vendor allowed list, the city currently has the MRSC list, and we have a resolution that has been adopted that annually renews. Is that correct, Matt? Okay, so it automatically annually renews. And so that limit has been changed to 50,000. The proposed within this policy is not to change the mayor's contract authority, which is currently 30,000, or the public works, which is 50, to signing any form of a contract. So that is not intended to change within this policy. But the main driving factor is the limits that are being driven that are going to be effective, well, June 30th. So by July 1st, the goal is to try to have this now adopted and in place. And we're trying to give us all plenty of time, knowing there's a bunch of other things going on with this policy.
Are there any questions? Councilmember Curtin.
Make sure the committee had a chance to.
They've already spoken.
So yeah, thanks, Director Bob, for the summary, and do appreciate, like in section 4.9, we talk about local business preferences as well as women and minority owned businesses and small businesses and federal owned businesses. I was wondering, has the state or the county given any guidelines as to doing environmentally sustainable purchases?
I would have to ask, and I would have to ask our city attorney.
So is the intent that the city take into account environmental considerations when making purchases?
Yeah, that is the intent, because as you know, we're introducing the climate action plan next Thursday, and one of the not to give too much away, that's basically part of the recommendations that that committee is making. So interesting to get the city policies aligned.
And these are the kind of, I think that would be a great question for Kim, because she might actually know of another city that might have some language. So I can definitely take that back, that feedback back.
Councilman Goldman, do you have any?
Yeah, just jumping off of this, so I, like in section 4.9.2, I totally understand the motivation. I'm just wondering, how does that, is the city subject to, was it I-1000, the one that basically says no affirmative action in Washington? Or is that limited to higher education?
That definitely sounds like an attorney question.
Right.
And I do know that she amended this into the document, so that would be a good question to ask.
Okay. Were you going to pass that along, or did you want me to reach out?
Oh, no, I will make sure she gets both of these questions.
Councilmember Good? Councilmember Sim?
I just had a question riddle for that. It's open. So you said 40,000, I'm seeing 50,000 and 30,000 is the ones in this document. I'm curious, I'm missing. Where
Where are you looking?
for the mayor's contractual limitation, is it 40 or 50?
The mayor's is 30.
30. Okay, sorry, okay. So that's for all other can execute contracts up to 30, we have up to 50 for public works. Those are the
Yes.
two limitations.
Yes, and then,
Perfect, I found it. I thought you said 40, so that's why I was like.
and,
oops, where
but the
am I?
small purchase quotes is 40. You did hear 40.
Okay,
40 is not, yeah, but as far as, like what the mayor on a contract could sign. But this is the small purchase, so this is like purchasing
okay,
versus, of materials and whatnot.
Okay.
So it's a little bit different than what a contract that the mayor would engage for services.
is that in here? Because I didn't find 40,000 in here, and I'm just curious if it's something that wants to be part of this policy, or is that referencing a
I
state limit?
think it's the reflecting with the RCW that's updating. And I noticed that when Kim was going through this, it was the RCW and whatever is applicable at the time, referring to if the RCW changes, that the policy stays in compliance as the RCW change, which seemed to be kind of an ongoing thing.
So you don't have to update it, even document.
Yeah,
it'll
it's
just
a reference. Yes, I noticed that she had put that in there a couple different times.
I'm curious if we want to have that in there with the reference to RCW, because then it's much easier for us to be able to, for, you know, for people to be able to know what that is,
Yeah,
rather than having to jump between different codes. It's just a thought. Because we do state the other limits as far as contracting limits, then it might be useful to have a purchasing limit identified somewhere.
It is purchasing limitations, 4.10. So the mayor, that he can do contracts up to 30 and that Public Works can do 50. Those are consistent with the current policies that are in place, being resolutions 617 and 1399. That's not, the intent is to not change that.
But I'm still asking about the $40,000. First, that, I guess this is where I think we need to kind of revisit
Probably.
this and make sure that it's saying what we want.
Right. And I think that the small works roaster uses 39. I think that's why she was putting the, and then the RCW in the tables under the Public Works project. Under 1, 2, 3, 4, the fourth row.
I'm sorry, which?
Item
section
5,
are you in?
section 5 table.
Sorry, Public Works project under section 5. And then that is one of the main things that she changed there. Which she left that there was the 116,155, and that's changing to 150 as of 7/1. That's another one that's changing.
I think it's useful as this is a policy to have all the purchasing and contracting powers of the administration identified in this one document.
Okay,
Rather, even if we're also referencing that this is coming from the RCW. And perhaps it's this or the RCW, whichever is
yeah,
less or more or whatever. We can amend it later
Yeah,
as RCW changes. I just feel like we're showing half the numbers, but not all of them, and it just. We could look into that.
yeah, I would offer that, I'm not sure if this was intended, but it talks about policies and procedure manuals, and it also talks about guidelines. I think as a resolution, it's really about policies, and that changes to the procedure manuals or guidelines is something that staff does and not part of what the council is doing. I have a bias of not putting procedures and manuals and guidelines into policies.
I hear you.
And so I'm also a bit reluctant to restate a lot of the materials that are already in the RCW. I would, my preference is policies should be clear, concise, and brief. And that guidelines and procedures should be at a level consistent with what's needed for the city to be able to manage within those policies. And so I get a bias against large policies that are trying to incorporate procedures or guidelines, which I don't believe should be in the policies. Or restating what's already in the RCWs. So, I mean, I'd be happy with a policy that says follow state law. Unless we want to do something particular or less than what we were otherwise authorized to do. I'm very familiar with, for example, section 3910, which happens to do with capital project procurement and procedures. I wouldn't want to restate what's in there because they get updated on a regular basis. If you simply just go and read RCW 3910, you know what you need to know.
Don't completely disagree, but from a transparency for people who aren't familiar with that code or how to get there or what it means, I feel like that there's a balance that we may need to strike between the transparency of what we are, because it deals with finances and
Maybe
and financial oversight.
maybe provide a link to what the RCW is. That somebody can find it. Another way.
Which I think is fine, it's just that I hesitant to put too much detail into a policy that otherwise needs to be reviewed and approved by the council, which for much of this is procedures about how you manage something is not a council action.
Yeah, administrative.
The policy says, if the law allows, the city may adopt up to X amount, but the council chooses to adopt less, then that's a council action. Where you wouldn't necessarily follow the RCW. Just because the RCW gives you authority doesn't necessarily mean that you are going to use that authority for a variety of reasons.
And if it is an up to, I still think if we're gonna use the highest of the up to, I think we should have a policy that states that, so it's not unclear whether, where we are, if it's an up to, that we do intend to use the fullest, capacity of the RCW, what they allow.
I would offer, I would just be silent. If it's permitted, and unless we are choosing to do something less. Because again, we end up with conflicts or misunderstandings. As you go through, it changes. It would come back,
Often, more often than you'd like to.
no, it changes it can change every
Yeah.
year. It's just that for many of those things, I don't think it's worth it. Unless there's specific, something that we would wish to address. Meaning, how you process the paper is an administrative issue. Whether the mayor can sign 30,000 or 50,000, so long as it's within RCW authority, then that's a council decision.
Like, yeah, I'm fully tracking what you're saying.
Because once you write it into the policy as a resolution, you then have to come back to council when you want to change. Even if it's not something that council would normally take action, because it's an administrative, such as procedure to guidelines. I don't want to unduly tie the flexibility that's necessary for the administration to perform its regular duties. Because coming back to council takes time and effort.
Well, and as we have found, it with a minimal staff, it's harder to stay on top of it as it changes. I'm just gonna be honest, it's a bandwidth thing for internally of staying on top of it and,
So I go back to a policy that says follow the law. Unless otherwise the council deems necessary to restrict the limitations that are afforded to the law is a reasonable policy. And not restate what's in the law. More is not necessarily better.
Because if you have two misstated facts, then you're calling out an RCW, but then the amount might be different, would be not good.
But it's also just an administrative function. If you want to change something that's written here, you have to come back.
so
Come to the
that's,
council because you want policy, not for,
and so
Procedures or
that's, I appreciate that feedback because then I appreciate that feedback.
so the administration should have procedures and guidelines. But those should be administrative, not councilmatic. That's my opinion, and I look to my council members for it as we go forward. But I don't think as a policy, we should be unduly burdening the administration.
And I don't disagree. It's like our investment policy. We give you the percentages that you can work within, but you have your policies and how you actually go about determining which investments to make, and that's a procedure on your end. The policy is the boundaries you're to work within. And I'm okay with that. I just feel like we should call out our boundaries rather than referencing RCW in this particular case, just because it's such a sensitive topic when we're talking about, the financial sort of policies of the community, but then we can continue to have that conversation.
Yeah, I would just offer, we've been doing business for many years. So I would offer, and this is why I started with, what's the intent and the desire to create something that is more robust. And the reason I would hope to see is because there's something that we feel that we need to feel that encompasses, requirements. The state says we need to have something for council policies and stuff. Absent that, I would say if this is mostly about procedures and guidelines, then that's an administrative function and not a council action that would require our review and approval. Again, we should be at the highest level and the administrator should have the flexibility to operate within those policies and develop appropriate guidelines and administrative procedures. So, Councilmember Furton.
Thanks, Chair. And just to echo what Chair Lebo was saying, for instance, the question I asked you about the environmental sustainability, if there's already a state procedure in place for that, well, there's no reason for us to restate that and just follow, as John says, the law. And yeah, I understand Councilmember Riddle's point that, in fact, it's nice to be transparent. But in this day and age when hardly anybody uses this material, right? They all look on there. If we put the link there, then it should make it fairly clear where we're getting our guidance from.
Now, I would offer that, for example, as a policy, we may choose to purchase environmentally sensitive materials and blah, blah, blah. That's not a requirement by the state. But as a council, we choose to do that. And that guidance would then be to the administration that says, we want you to purchase all recyclable blah. Not that I know what blah is.
Please be thoughtful when purchasing, because sometimes it might be feasible and sometimes that may not be something that's feasible to comply with, but something along those lines.
Again, the policy is we wish to be environmentally sensitive to
Yes.
purchase recycled materials. The flexibility then is to give to the administration when feasible, when appropriate, when within certain bounds. We don't want to do something that's silly.
They double.
Well, if we consciously choose to do that, but normally that's a very good point. We wouldn't want to pay an excessive price. Bryce, any other comments?
No, I'm just trying to see how easy the RCW is to understand, because that's the big thing, is it's typically not that easy to understand.
So, what do you see as the next steps in the time?
Well, I probably wasn't planning to bring this back until the beginning of June, so that might actually be appropriate to give us some time for me to connect directly with the city attorney in order to see how to break out and maybe look at our resolution 617 and 1399 and just maybe have one very simple resolution stating very simply our intent with our authorities that council is, whether they're keeping them the same, if those are decided to change, and simplify the resolution and take this more into keep it on a policy level that council's adopting as you described, and then also break it out and have a procedures document that is for everybody's consumption that is actually administratively purchasing on this level.
And I would think that's reasonable. I would also caution you that be careful about asking council to consider or to comment on something for which we're not being asked to approve. Meaning procedures, guidelines, and
No, that's what I was
administrative
saying, pull it
should-
out
should-
completely.
Should not would not be come
Yes.
before the council.
That is, so yes, sorry, let me clarify. We would be then we would be bringing forward the portion of policy that we would be asking you to adopt breaking out the procedures of which we no longer would be asking for guidelines on, only for internal staff consumption, but having clear guidelines internally as the intended procedure, not bringing that back to council. So one piece,
So with
the
that,
other piece.
so with that in mind, I would like to ask my council members, does that seem like an appropriate direction? Given the effort that's been put in today?
I would say that if you're going down that path, then either stick with it or not, so yes.
Yes. Yes, I see a number of heads nodding. Councilmember Riddle.
Well, yeah, seems about right. We'll take a look.
Okay.
Okay, now we have this as a draft, so we can always compare with what you come back with. And if we think that there are elements in this that we should be in a policy, then we would have the opportunity to address. But otherwise, I
Yeah.
think the direction is that keep it high level, focus on policy, administrative function guidelines. Procedures should be left to the administration, not for council review.
I understand.
I
I got it. I can help.
I was gonna say, I'm looking to Matt not just for understanding, like, look at the new task we have ahead of us to, and
Sure.
I'm looking as a partner for some
Yeah, so-
assistance.
So policy is something when you need it from us. Otherwise, you should have the flexibility to have the procedures and guidelines for you to do your business. And we would look to you that you have those in place because when you're audited, they will they'll first go to your policies and then they'll go to your procedures and they'll look at your guidelines. So there's an expectation that those are in place. And I think it's well placed. Thank you, an interesting discussion.
Okay,
Where,
Oh.
I'm hearing you say come back in June. And that the direction is to focus on policy, if you think that there's something you want the council to take action. And we would review it in June, and then we can compare it to our draft to see if there's something else to
Yep.
include that otherwise would not, otherwise you chose not to put in. Right. Now, your goal is to have this in place by June 30th. Is that correct?
yeah, and yes, and it sounds like that's
Now, I will ask the other way. Does it matter? Because when state law takes effect, we don't necessarily need action by the council.
I would have to check in with you and see how our other resolutions are written. Because I think they state the actual dollar amount and those would need to, we would need to make sure that we would
We do actually need to update the.
Update or repeal then. In
repeal.
which case we just rely on state law.
Yeah, so I do think it's listed on that.
Yeah, it is listed on that, but so we do have to repeal those, and put a new one in place to make it to follow the state law. So
Yeah.
that we're still in compliance.
So the question then is, if the state gives us authority up to a certain limit, is there any reason why we wouldn't follow that and that we would want something different? Otherwise, one strategy is simply to adopt the state limits. Going forward, then you don't have to make changes. So again, it's about flexibility.
Yeah,
That's-
that's a legal question.
And that's how we, that's how we actually wrote our federal policy, was with that same outline of, as these change, we will comply. So that, because the federal policy was, to keep it in compliance. As that changes too, so that makes sense.
For us, it's about, is there something you want from us that's different? Otherwise.
I think we still are going to have to, we are going to need a revision of repeal,
Yep.
maybe repeal, replace,
Yeah, we'll bring back a draft.
Or-
June 13th.
Okay.
but yeah, I was gonna say, I don't think we can turn around something like tomorrow for the
No, it's
23rd. I don't know, I mean, we're good, but I don't know if we're that good. But we'll first in June and then if there's no issues, then maybe even just bring back on the second one in June. If I'm not there, you can carry.
I
it.
see a number of nodding heads. So I will interpret.
We're
that
good.
We're good.
We're good.
Thank you for the discussion. And it's good that we're looking at what the state law is doing and how our policies and procedures reflect what we need to do.
Yes.
Make a distinction between what's council policy and procedures and guidelines.
Thank you.
Thank you. Which brings us down to our 23-24 budget amendment.
Budget amendment, yes.
Director Vaughn, if you could walk us through that.
So, we're gonna put this up on the, just so as we have the discussions, the document, and this is what we just define as the schedule of adjustments. So I'm just,
So which page should we be looking at?
oh, I'm sorry, I don't have, what, do you mind if I look?
24.
24.
In our packet.
It's 24 of your packet.
Thank you.
Thank you. The little bugs in here are problematic and can be very distracting. So, perfect, thank you so much. So walking through down the general fund first. Police is at the top, police services, we are asking to increase their overtime. But not because their overtime is consistently going over, it's because the overtime is going over on the expenditure side due to them assisting outside agencies that the city is being reimbursed for. So it's a pass through. We're increasing it on the revenue side, and then we're increasing it also on the expenditure side. So you'll see it on both sides. Body worn cameras, pass through, the Star Chase grant, that's gonna be another pass through. The WASPIC traffic safety grant, that is going to be another pass through. Which means you're just gonna see them on both sides, revenues and the expenditure. And then walking down the sewer utility tax. Again, we just kept that really conservative with it being the first budget. But we do need to amend that up a little bit to as revenue to the general fund, but then expense that will be receipted in the enterprise funds. So, and then walking down, the police foundation donated a very set amount due to the vehicle outfitting, which is the new Tahoes. In order to, what outfitting means is just everything that goes along with the police car. You purchase the car and then the police have to have a very specific, all the inside components, equipment that go with it to keep everybody safe. And so that is what they donated that amount, just 30,000, almost 30,500. So that will be then sent as an expenditure out to the 501 where we pay for those vehicles. So you'll see that amount 4 times through this budget amendment. The community development of commerce, the 62,000, that is going to be a direct pass through. So we're going to see it as revenue, and it will also be an expenditure. The passport revenue, we have increased that. You'll see an expenditure tied out. The investment interest, you're going to see that kind of across the board as coming in higher than very conservatively estimated and budgeted. I want to call this out as I'm calling it an other source because technically it's refundable if anything like this is not technically revenue to the city. It's a deposit. They call them kind of like a deposit account, and you're going to see that exact dollar amount tied to an expenditure. So it's that too will show as a pass through.
Does that mean that, so for example, for permit applications,
Yes.
so they deposit a certain amount of money and then it's drawn against
Yes.
as the permit.
As right, yes, as the permits are
Actual.
submit, thank you for the word that I was not coming up with. So then walking down to the expenditure side, city council, travel, we're expanding that just a little bit, due to the opportunity, that we had some council members that had the opportunity to go to Washington DC, which was, a great opportunity. The city council, were increasing just slightly their professional services budget, the executive training, and, the executive professional services, that's being increased slightly. That, the executive is, administration being, it has, basically our city administrator, our HR are all within that budget, and expanding the training just a little bit on, or the travel, excuse me, on that one too. Volunteer and staff recognitions, that budget was very modestly budgeted, and we definitely are exceeding it. And then the other piece is within our staff or within our handbook, we have staff recognition. And that is something that since the pandemic, we have gotten away from, years of service and little awards that go back to years of service. And that is definitely an internal morale booster. And so definitely we are kind of starting that program back up. One that was already in place, just unfortunately it hit a back burner, but for very understandable reasons. So then walking down the municipal salaries, this is for the passport clerk, the membership for the National League of Cities, the finance department. We broke out specifically our banking services to show that on a line item, and that did not have any budget allocated. So we're breaking that out and showing it separately. The police salaries, we are actually reducing, that is a true reduction. We are reducing the one position, leaving as the city council adopted the +3 for the limited term. That continues to be a struggle to fill all those positions. So we are leaving the +2, but taking one limited term position back. And so you're going to see that both on the salaries and the benefits. And then the overtime, that is a direct pass through from outside agencies reimbursing. Then the grants, the WASPIC, the body worn cameras, pass through, and the Star Chase. Going down to the animal control that I mentioned was going over, so we're amending that. Jail expenses, I feel like that one we have talked about significantly. The public defender contract back in December was proposed for this next year to exceed what we had budgeted. So we're expanding that contract by $33,000.
So we're matching what we approved and now we're just.
Correct. Now we're allocating,
Allocating
the
to
addition.
cover it.
correct.
Thank you.
And that is true on what I'm about to say here in addition to, so the parks maintenance, the tree removal contract, since you brought up that great point, I'm just gonna jump down and talk about that. The parks maintenance, the tree removal contract, I believe it's in streets and surface water, those three. There's an allocation that is for a contract that was already approved by council, but that budget was not allocated. So now here, the budget is being allocated for the best educated guess that we think the city will use just for 2024. And where was I? Oh, the community development, that pass through. The sound transit, that's a direct pass through on cost, revenue to expenditure. The parks maintenance salaries, the seasonal salaries, you're going to see that in multiple funds. As previously, the city was, when seasonals would come in, typically it was over the summer and they would help just keep up on parks. That has changed. So we did a reevaluation from what they were doing last year and this year, and so actually broke it out to be more accurate, to be distributed across where they're actually spending their time, so that all funds are appropriately paying for the services they're receiving from the staff. Facilities, that's the same thing, seasonals, and then the transfer out from the police foundation for outfitting the Tahoes that were purchased.
So question, so we increased our seasonals,
Mhm.
because we didn't have the staff to do it, or we didn't have enough staff to do it? In other words, were there positions that were vacant?
There
Yeah.
are positions currently, and yes, there have been positions that were vacant. And we were able to hire seasonals to assist in getting the work done. And previously, I believe it was the past 2 years or more, the city has not been able to hire seasonals. But the disconnect was the hourly allocated amount that we put into the original adopted budget is not anywhere close to what we actually ended up being able to hire and pay them.
Does this budget adjustment reflect the positions that had been open and the unspent salary for them? Is
So
that
when-
being offset in this
So,
budget?
so
The
that
no-
is a
the
fact,
known vacancies.
that is a factor. But also when people leave an organization, they call it your compensated absences. You have a buyout, so sometimes vacation and whatever their Teamsters agreement, you're bound to, so you have to, as people retire and leave an organization, you also have a financial obligation, and so that plays into it in addition. So there are some vacant positions that are open and there's some salary savings, so there's a little bit there in addition, but there's a lot that goes into play for the salary piece of it. And the main driver is that we way under budgeted in the original budget, cost wise. And so they do have more positions hired for seasonals, because right now that is what they're able to hire. Seasonals, when we talk about that, maybe it's worth just a minute to explain. We hire seasonals, and we only, when we refer to them as a seasonal employee, it's for less than 6 months. They cannot work. And what has happened with our previous seasonals is if they have worked out well, we've transitioned them into permanent maintenance employees. Sometimes that works and sometimes that doesn't work. So the city has been able to do that with a couple of them.
So, but we're not seeing necessarily the salary savings on the full-time salary savings side.
Not enough.
But we're not seeing it here, or is that accommodated into this seasonal salaries, takes into account what we've saved, and this is still above and beyond that? I'm trying to figure out.
So there
What the math
there is some savings, but it's not enough to cover what they're costing us. And the fact that we only intended during our original budget to hire 2 seasonals, and we've hired more than that. And so there just isn't, and at a much higher rate. So the
Okay,
higher rate.
So is $15,000 just the cost of new seasonals, or is it the cost of the new seasonals minus the savings that we've had, and where in
Correct.
reality, the cost was higher than $15,000?
Correct.
Okay,
And you're gonna see it across, it's not just gonna be in parks. It's going to be in parks, facilities, you're gonna see it in streets, you're gonna see it across your entire budget. So the parks is only a portion of where their salary is allocated and where those seasonal employees are working.
Do I see any other questions?
I'll
Councilmember Golden,
let you go first.
I'm sorry, did I miss you? No. You're good. Councilmember Goldman.
So two questions. The first is about passports.
Mhm.
So it looks like passport revenue was 45,000. And then passport expenses was 40,000. So it's sort of marginal increase of 5,000.
I'm being very conservative.
Okay, so
I'm being very conservative because I don't want to, from what was stated previously, and yes, it likely will come in way higher than that as was presented. This goes back to, I guess, just a little bit of a budgeting philosophy to always not quite go as full as you think you will end up bringing in on the revenue side, being very cautious on that side.
makes sense. I hope to be pleasantly surprised at the end of the year then with passport revenue. And then my other questions about investment income. So my understanding is like the kind of a purpose of doing these treasuries is that we know the interest rate we're gonna be getting. So I guess the question is, how come we need to make amendments if we knew what we were getting?
Because that has changed. We've already turned over multiple government agency bonds. We've already turned a couple of those over. In addition, we have a big portion of our, not a big portion, but the larger portion of our money that is
Oh, so this includes the local government.
an investment, all of it.
Okay, that actually answers my question.
So it's that variable rate. This portion, I'm very clear on, that's very predictable, very stable. It's the local government investment pool and the bank's reserve that are the variable rate that with all of the discussions that were going on over a year ago, everybody was budgeting and thinking that portion of money you needed to be very cautious on what you were stating for your interest investment.
That makes sense. I'm pleasantly surprised that my personal money market account is still paying over 5%. So
Yeah.
that makes sense. Thank you.
But just to clarify, you mentioned there's two parts of it. So there's the variable rate for the intergovernmental loan. But as you turn over the treasuries, you can get new rates which would have new incomes that wouldn't necessarily be reflected when you initially did your budget.
Correct,
And they could be up or down,
Makes sense.
correct.
but they would represent generally within a certain range, move a lot. So for budget purposes, you can at least count on a certain amount.
And yes, but back to kind of some philosophies, when you can, in my, the way that I have always gone about it is whatever is set that I have predictable, if it's not predictable and I don't know what, then I'm going to be able to purchase that next laddering interest rate at, I treat those funds equivalent to the LGIP.
And that's a conservative approach because it's not going to be less, generally speaking.
That's
Unlikely.
Unlikely.
Yeah.
yes.
But it is a conservative approach, which is fine.
And that's normally I don't go into this detail, but we're here having this conversation. So I figure maybe it's just time for you to know a little bit more of my philosophies on how I go about it. So walking to the street fund.
So before we do that, so the net here is a reduction of
Mhm.
the adjustment of this.
Yes,
This is on the expenditure side, so.
yes, so
$324,000, that's in the
yes,
red.
yes, negative. We're allocating an additional from what yes, if we're just talking net or
Somewhere along the line, we need to figure out how we make it 324,000.
In revenue.
or referred to as operating. This is where I will say that when on the graphs and the charts that I show of operating, this is just the revenue to expenditures. So yes.
So right now, this very
Yes.
simple one. We're running $320,000 more in expenditures on a net basis for the general fund than otherwise.
Yes. And yes,
More to come.
So then, walking down to the street fund, so we're gonna have the, interest investment, the, seasonals, the roadside maintenance, which is the tree removal contract, again, parks, streets, and I think the third place is, the surface water fund. So you'll see that one more time as we continue. We also estimated very conservatively on the transportation benefit district sales tax of the 0.01, just monitoring, not trying to overstate revenue, but we do need to amend that, especially with some of the other conversations taking place about resolutions that are in this discussion. So we do need to amend that. Contingency fund, budget stabilization fund, those are just interest, investment interest increases on the revenue side. And the only reason I'm actually even doing that is because the way that it shows in the budget, I'll just explain this, is we over received within 2023. So the number that it shows in, because we take the two numbers for the budget, it's showing as a negative number, which just, in my opinion, looks bad because that's not, because it's revenue. So I'm just, it's that in my mind is a housekeeping thing. And a true up. So then walking down to the strategic opportunity, this is another one, the strategic opportunity. This is also referred to back on the dashboard as the lakefront property. And so here, the RCO grant, the city has already received I think it was $1,080,000 that is actually currently received in the bank. And that was the interfund loan purchase payoff. So that plus the RCO is intending for the other, there's another portion of that grant that they have awarded us for an additional $270,000 that is tied specifically to the demo. So that's where adding that additional $270,000, that's where that number is coming from.
So that's the, with the 1,350,000. So it's the 1,080,000 plus the 270,000.
Yes.
So, okay.
That we're anticipating, the 1,080,000 the city has already received, plus the 270 that the city anticipates receiving within 2024. Walking that down to the lakefront park property development for phase 2, the city's anticipating, oh, I kind of walked right over that, but that's okay. We'll continue that conversation. So the city will, the 270,000 is included in the lakefront property development, plus the 600,000 that's coming from on the revenue side that I accidentally just skipped right over, but it's all part of the conversation. That is 600,000 that's being transferred from the capital improvement fund into the strategic opportunity fund, is to assist in phase 2 during the lakefront park property development. So that now is expanding that budget by the 870, 270 being from grants, 600 being from another fund supporting it. And then back to just making the housekeeping, the interfund loan, just amending that has already been paid back, but just making the books, that's more of a housekeeping item. Because when that was allocated, I'll just say it was previously, and then it walked into 2023, which we did not anticipate it going that far. So then walking down into the ARPA fund. So on this one, at this time, everything within the ARPA, this fund needs to be allocated by the end of this year. I am going to have I do have a conversation because Phil and I had a conversation today, because everything needs to be committed by the end of 2024, every single dollar, and for these funds, period. Now, back to how the lost revenue, we need to show the allocation, the lost revenue on the 200,000 in the original budget that was adopted. The city intended to spend 200,000 for a surface water master plan directly from ARPA. Due to all the moving parts in the budget, that never made it in on the expenditure side, or the out of the ARPA into, and so that transaction, even though it was intended to happen, it never materialized on the budget side. It was one that got overlooked, just as simple as that. That being said, it needs to be allocated in order to be done.
So it's just a paperwork thing. We intended, it just wasn't done, or allocated so that we can expend to create the surface water.
To create, yes, the surface water master plan. And that you will see in a little later in the budget amendment. And then the rest of the funds were taken as lost revenue, which have assisted in the general government services. All of the, just reminding everybody, all of the AV system, the Muni code that we continue to pay, public safety, which is the additional pluses that we had allocated, the limited term, ARPA fund management, RACER, and all of those kind of, and all of those kind of expenses. And then at this point, just everything is going to just be a negative number on a net change, because we have to allocate it by the end of 2024. So this negative number here, that's what you would expect to see. It all needs to be allocated.
And just based off of from the budget monitoring, it looks like we're shy of $90,000 remaining. Based off of this non-operating department number.
The way I did this is I went directly to the cash balance. Because even if there's budget that's unallocated, there is, I don't know if there's anything left within. I might have to circle back on to you on that one, on that question. If there's anything, or if that was just budget that was unexpended.
Yeah,
It
okay.
was allocated but unexpended, and that may have been the case. Okay.
But the budget amount reflects sort of the upper limit, so it's better to be over
Yes,
and under, because otherwise you have to make a budget adjustment.
yes.
Okay.
So
So at the end of the year, you true it up.
yes, and yes. So, and we will be circling back on this conversation too of the funds, that everything that's allocated versus what has been then committed with projects, because that's going to be the ongoing, because it's committed to projects and has to be committed by 2024, and spent by the end of 2026. So those are the rules. So going down to the capital improvement fund, again, the the improvement fund is 35,000, and then walking down to the, I'm seeing that there is an error there. So we're gonna have to fix that. So the 600,000 that's going into the strategic opportunity will be showing as out of that fund.
So I'm sorry, just to clarify, so which one?
So in the capital improvement,
Yes.
that should have a $600,000 expenditure going out, which will then walk into, and I can send you guys a revised document. So it will be transferring out of the strategic or the capital improvement fund And then as I took the moment, if doing the strategic opportunity fund. If we, can we scroll up, Matt, just a little bit? Okay, right there. So transfer in from capital improvement fund, 600,000. And I know it was in there, so somehow it didn't, got deleted or. Anyways, so.
Numbers
Well,
do that.
Well, I did work with this document, hiding things and whatnot, and so I wonder, I'm not sure what I did, I'm sure I did it somehow. So there's a $600,000 that'll be coming out of that will be going into 106, which is the strategic opportunity.
So the net change will be a negative 565.
Yes. And I can update that and send it out to everybody to see that. So then if we walk down to the transportation capital fund, again, just increasing that interest, and then the Safe Streets Early Action, that additional 110 is due to a couple of traffic studies, in addition to some traffic improvements that the city's intending to all have completed within 2024. And then the sewer utility fund, the sewer utility service charge tax, that is revenue in from the customers. It's also an expense to that fund, which then walks into revenue in the general fund.
Pardon me. So under the sewer utility fund, are the numbers,
Oh, the net change wasn't, it's 0. It's 71 to 71. So,
so where it says 50, it should be 70. Up above, but you have two revenues at 50 and 21, doesn't it? 71.
yes,
And then down below, where you got expenditures, isn't that really 71?
so the net change, yeah, both of them.
Yeah.
It didn't drag. It summed. This is in Excel.
That nasty.
I thought you were just checking to see if we're.
Well, I was.
There you go.
I appreciate that. Now
Good
I've caught
selfie.
2 mistakes, and I noticed that as I was going over this, that I spelled improvements wrong, so let's just keep calling it out. I'm on a roll. I am on a roll.
That's a very teacher thing to do.
Yeah, I literally have it underlined, yes, so why not? Learning opportunity, isn't that what we call that, Councilmember Goldman?
I do the same thing. If I make a mistake in the slide, it's because I wanted the students to catch it. That's
Yeah.
right.
Awesome, I'm gonna remember that one, just seeing if you're paying attention.
It's under safe, it's a safe.
Yeah,
street
keep
transportation.
looking, keep looking, just,
Something 26.
oh, thanks. Okay, surface water utility fund. God, yes.
Who knew budgeting was so much fun?
You had no idea that spelling was gonna be part of numbers. I know, right? Whew. Yes, I am definitely making my grandmother, who won a spelling bee, very proud right now. Okay, back to being serious. Surface water utility fund. So the surface water, the utility tax, again, it's revenue that comes in, expenditure to this fund then becomes revenue to the general fund. The employee salaries, that's the seasonal, again, the surface water maintenance, the tree contract, so a small portion. And we did that based off of what occurred in looking at 2023's. And then the system maintenance and operations, that has been just expending a little bit higher than anticipated due to the maintenance and operations and what has gone into that. And then this is where I put in the surface water plan. was into the utility fund. So then walking down to the surface water capital, the interest investment, then we have the two projects that were not originally anticipated in this budget, which is the 35th Avenue and drainage, and I have that broken out as design and construction. And then the 28th Avenue culvert repair design and construction. And so those are all anticipated. Actually, I shouldn't say that. I'm gonna revise that statement. So it's likely that it's possible that the 28th culvert repair could occur this year, but we're gonna have to see staff wise if that is able to be handled. So, and then walking down.
Just
oh,
checking your total net change
Yeah,
there.
I'm on a roll.
I'm seeing,
On a roll.
so.
Yes.
So right now we've got the 35th and 28th showing.
So it's gonna be a
in the
bigger,
first column, but not.
it'll be
the third.
a bigger swing, yeah.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, the
That was,
750 is
it's not
accurate,
intentional.
yeah.
So the net change is 715 minus,
So,
it is 715.
700, sorry, minus, it'll be -700.
yes,
Do math on TV.
that's pretty, I mean, even though it is evening, that one's pretty easy. Even I would have done that math on TV. So then going down to the vehicle equipment and replacement fund, transferring in from the general fund, the police foundation again, and adding some investment interest, and then also adding it to the expenditure side of, from that, the foundation, donation to make that line item whole. And that concludes my budget amendment. Are there any?
Councilmember Good. Councilmember Ray.
Not much. I think I appreciate the detail of the amendment. I always in my mind wonder, what does this then do to the budget as a whole? It's kind of like that
Mhm.
final,
Yeah,
so if we could kind of
The whole
eventually see
table.
that, like what is our actual,
well, yeah, this is
this is the
yeah.
detail of the changes
Mhm.
only. My brain likes to look at both eventually, so
Yeah.
it'd be nice to have that fitted out.
Councilmember Goldman.
Thanks, yeah, kind of echoing, Councilmember Riddle, it's kind of helpful, 30,000 foot level. Are there any of these funds that you're concerned about because they're decreasing in a non-sustainable way? Just, what's the big picture for our budget?
Our challenge fund continues to be surface water. And just for, I mean, I'll just be straightforward, it's for absolutely unforeseen capital projects that keep coming up that are unforeseen. It's just that. That's definitely an area that I'm,
Just don't really have very many options for funding that fund.
and so that's, if you want, yeah, that's my pretty candid.
Another problem child.
It's, and I will, but I'm gonna go back and say that, we had that conversation 2 years ago. And we increased it, the rates, 10% 2 years in a row. And so council has been taking action in order to, because we have been, so the city has been so proactive on culverts and stream maintenance and whatnot, which is, these are good reasons to have a fund be in, kind of not, being expended out per se. But that fund, that surface water fund and the capital side are tending to just be an area that I'm paying attention to right now on to evaluate what we think we need to have a discussion as council for this upcoming budget, as far as I'm connecting those dots that far in advance at this point with this.
So, Councilmember Good.
I asked the question, does that include the pump houses that are down on
The lift stations.
the lift station?
Oh,
Lift
that's,
stations.
okay, so that's sewer. That's a different fund.
Okay.
So that fund, I do not, the sewer capital fund, we continue to bring in and keep adding to the sewer capital fund, and I'm not, that's not an area that I'm,
Okay, I just.
but that's a great question.
And that project is not part of this adjustment, because we don't know enough about it yet.
Yeah, that will have to be, I'll have to get our public works director involved on that one to answer that question of when that's coming down.
And can I make just a suggestion? I know that sometimes we refer to these funds by their number, and sometimes we'll say transfer to this fund 301. Is there a way that the numbers can be consistently shown so that we can tie it, especially like the strategic opportunity fund, sometimes the lakefront property fund, because that's what we're using it for. But the number means the number, so I don't know if that's useful for anyone else, but I like having that one tool to connect them all across documents.
I think that's a good,
Yeah,
a good reminder. It helps us as we go through the budget, we start to see, talk about those items. Question, are there any other, budget, elements that we need to adjust on the, for example, on the revenue side? So if we get additional revenue off the street traffic cameras, we need to make any adjustments there, because that goes back to this larger question. You know, if we see a lot of negatives, where does that mean we're gonna end up at the end of the year?
I'm just gonna say, I think that goes back to a little bit of a philosophy thing. Once that is adopted and there's some changes and we are seeing those changes come through as a revenue source. As the finance director, I'm much more comfortable bringing forward to you when I have a month or two's worth of data to say, okay, this is what we're starting to see as the trend. Here's, if we keep that trend, here's the conservative side. I'm comfortable doing this.
Do you think that'll be after the 30 days of warning, or would you like 30 days of
I don't-
infractions to be able to kind of feel out what that projection might start looking like for the rest of the year?
I think that we're gonna be looking at that probably third to fourth quarter of amending.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you for that. So as a dashboard, what we see are sort of those discrete elements. What's not there, what are the trend lines that, both on the expenditure and the revenue side to show where you think you're gonna end up in. And it can,
Is I guess maybe can I ask a question? Would you like to see it amended now on this one? Or not yet?
I think your explanation is a good one, and I think it's fine. We'll look to the council members. But is there a way that as we look at these dashboards that we can see, are there sort of low and highs in terms of expenditures, revenues, to give you a sense of where you think it's going to end up at the end of as a range? Because again, it has to do with tax revenues may not accrue as you think they are, as well as expenditures may continue to increase above and beyond what you're showing. Because the question is always, are we going to hit the mark at the end of the year?
Right.
And, you know, if you have increasing revenue and you have increasing expenditures, so long as they're increasing so that at the end of the year they balance out, that's great. Am I, council member for a time?
But at the same time, I appreciate your point, Chair Lebo, but I guess it's the same way with the surface water unintended capital projects. I would, at this moment, have no idea what that anticipated revenue from the safety cameras is going to be. So I don't even know how to do even a high and low on that. We have some estimates from the transfer, of course. But again, basically relying on that one estimate just seems dicey.
And if, let me just, put a little, if that is the will of the council to say, yes, let's go with this estimate and we do it together, I'm in. I'm okay with that. If we make a knowledgeable decision together as partners. And versus me being outside my comfort zone, because that is outside my comfort zone. Just acknowledging
Councilmember.
I'm just thinking because we have a biennial budget year coming up, and that's gonna be a lot of volume of work. I'm trying to find that sweet spot between when we have some data from the traffic cams and we can do a budget adjustment so that we have a better sense of where we're gonna be at the end of the year based off of some more true numbers. But before we hit the pressures of the full biennial budget pressure, so like that August, September sort of zone. I think that will give us like the best data
that.
and not overwhelm us when we're trying to do the other budget work.
Would that be a separate line item? I mean, are they broken out into separate line items like the school cam as opposed to the after?
No, it's one line item on your dashboard, and just. So it's one line item,
But would it be separated out? At some point, is there a need, would there be a need?
I don't,
Because doesn't the new traffic camera revenue have to be earmarked for a particular?
I
use?
think I will have to circle back, but I thought it was after this.
This camera. Well, let's circle back, because I can't remember what.
I think it's after this, but then you do have a separate line item that shows the traffic safety camera broken out for expenses at the very bottom of your operating. And then the traffic safety cameras, you also have broken out on the revenue side individually, and I can put dollar amounts, I can tell
I
dollar
mean, I
amounts.
think it might be helpful at some point to see the difference between the two. Of, with the school cam and the speed cam, I don't know.
Especially if it's earmarked for traffic safety, whereas the other one is a general fund available funding, so.
And maybe if it's not done now,
So
it's
this,
just a placeholder.
That's a question we have to track.
so I will have to double check because this is city court, because court is the one that ultimately makes the call on what the actual fine. And when I asked the judge one time, can you give me a simple way to estimate this? Boy, did I get an earful. She showed me her screen and she's like, I can make any one of these decisions at this. And so I very quickly realized that it was not as simple as tickets versus a cost and coming up with an estimate along those lines. It is much more complex than that because she can make a decision. She has a lot that she can do within that. And so I might just have to circle back with how we could give you what you're looking for.
No, I don't know even if it's relevant, but I would just think that at some point, even if it's an average of the high, the low, and it may be useful information at some.
High to low,
Well, if there's a decision, yes or no, you'll have an average of whatever is.
sorry. I meant then, just to help me understand high and low, what are we?
I mean, not high and low, I
of
meant
the
if-
traffic cameras? Of the.
Excuse me, if the judge has to make a decision, there's still money coming through.
She can waive it. She also can,
But she's not gonna waive it every time,
no,
and she's not, so that's what I'm saying, is there's probably an average. That if you needed a placeholder and you needed a number,
Yeah.
that you could use that.
So, I would suggest that we're not asking you to do something typically right now.
Right.
Perhaps we can have a conversation about what we can do and whether or not that seems reasonable to help us understand the larger
Yeah.
picture. And I will take that on, if that's okay with the council. Council member for time.
Yeah, and just for clarity, one of the questions that was asked was, isn't it going in a separate pedestrian safety or pedestrian multimodal safety account? The answer is yes, for the cameras that we authorize after June 6th. So the ones that we're potentially authorizing now, they go into the same fund as what the school zone cameras are doing right now.
But would you track those two cameras separately? But
No,
why, and why
I
not?
don't think so.
it's because, and I'm speaking for you, sorry about this.
Okay, no, go ahead.
But as the director of finance had mentioned to me earlier, all that, she gets one number from the court, basically.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And I don't, that's the part is I am not 100%. I don't think it's even broken out when it's receipted into the way that the court receives the money that on tickets, it's just a traffic, in their mind, it's just a traffic fine ticket. I don't know if they break it out to where it's school zone versus red light. I'm not 100%
Are they
sure.
different amounts? Are they different? No, they're not different.
Not at this
Okay,
time.
Okay.
And so I would have to educate myself a little bit more again, because I know I've had that conversation, but it was years ago. Back when Kathy was the court administrator, so that has been a while.
But I'm hearing though that we may need to get into that track.
Yeah, and I'm not,
I'm just suggesting
Mhm.
that at some point, it doesn't have to be resolved at this moment, but at some point it may become a relevant question as to what is what, and, what's going, or how are both these camera systems working as far as the money?
and,
And I mean,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, it can be sorted by date of infraction, but I don't think we're tracking that. Or not date, but the time of the infraction, because that's what determines which one they get hit with. But I don't think we're tracking at that level of detail.
How about we do this? There is a desire for the council to understand,
Yeah.
as these budget adjustments are being made, what do we think that's gonna end up at the end of the year? And how might we get a better sense of that? And I will take the action to work with you to see what we can do. And then I think you're also hearing some comments from the council that with the new traffic cameras, if they are adopted, maybe could be tracked in a different way. And I'm
Be ready for it now instead of later.
it's just, we're offering you free advice.
So,
So I'll just
You may
leave it as
appreciate
no
it being
action,
tracked.
but just that we've had this conversation.
mhm.
Any? Good, good.
And I will just say that I think there's a couple other things that are in the works, and although we might not have a budget amendment of this size, we might have a small budget amendment doing there might be a couple things that we adjust.
I think that's fine, and at this
Little
moment,
later.
at this time, that we're not asking you to, for example, if you believe that the traffic camera revenue is gonna come in higher, than we adopt a revenue adjustment.
I think it would be in our best interest to possibly wait and evaluate it, and then if we have enough information to amend it in the third quarter, that whatever handful of items might also need to be amended at that time, that we do maybe a small budget amendment.
Okay, that's
Again.
fine. That's fine. Yep. Okay. In number of mounting heads. Is there anything more with regard to the budget adjustments? You'll send out an updated.
Yeah, yes, correcting all of yes, doing things too quickly.
It's all good. It's all good. I try not to, the number of times I make errors.
It's humbling.
So, thank you for the discussion and the presentation about the 23-24 budget amendment. So we'll see this coming forward. for council action. And do you anticipate that coming? Just, where, is that next week?
No, I don't think I can.
No, that's fine.
No,
I'm just it's just a question. There's not anything intended to suggest that.
probably, June, the first one in June, and then we'll go from there.
Just an awareness.
Yes, just walking through the details of it first.
We've had an interesting discussion about traffic safety cameras, so let's talk about traffic safety camera.
So, I, am going to, do you want me to give a swing at it and then, okay, so, you have before you and, quite a bit of detail in the attached packet, and it will also be coming forward at this next council meeting on the 23rd. And so all of that information is in this packet and the one that you will be receiving tomorrow. And it is, this draft ordinance will be in there in addition. So it's basically taking the fines and increasing them. So it's increasing it currently from 136 up to 145. And then also increasing the repeat offenders or excessive, if there's any additional excessive speed that is captured on that camera, that traffic safety camera, then the monetary value will go up to $290.
Question, is that
Under.
11 miles over, or is this
30.
30, okay,
Oh,
31 miles?
The
That's
three is
the-
crossed out.
Yeah, I know.
It is supposed to be 11?
No, it's supposed to be 31, I think. Well, maybe it's supposed to be 11. Maybe it's supposed to be
It went
11.
from 13 to
It's supposed to
11.
be total 30.
11.
Well, if the school speed limit is 20, then 31, an absolute speed of 31 is 11 over the school limit.
Okay,
We'll,
and this is,
we'll get it clarified.
okay.
this is miles per hour over the posted school zone. So yeah, 20 plus 11 is 31. Exactly what you said. School zone.
And these amounts are based off of House Bill 2384, which goes into effect June 6th. So they're raising the amounts for infractions to 145, and then fines will be doubled for school speed zone infractions to 290.
In excess, 11 miles in excess, is that what's in there?
I believe so, yes.
If we could,
Yeah, we'll get it clarified.
Was that your understanding of it?
And that was also my understanding of it, and this is, the state gave us reasonably broad statutory authority over this. I understand that Seattle goes even higher in this, so it is the case that we're following, I believe what the state's guidelines of the legislation are. Right.
There wasn't a third tier, was there? First offense, second offense, and then additional offenses? I can't remember. My brain's going back really deep into thought there.
Not that I know.
It was just the first and then the repeat offenses.
Yeah.
And we are specifically calling out particular miles per hour over posted school zone speed limit here. Are we intending to provide that for the speed cameras as well in the non-school speed limit times?
I don't
Wait,
actually know what the answer to that question
Okay.
is, so I'll have to get back to you on that, but that is a really good point.
So,
Because 11 over 25 would be 36 then.
yeah, And if I recall, there was 2 articles that came out in 2 different online, and they each reported different miles per hour, at which point the ticket would be incurred
Yes.
in a different.
Yes.
So I think, yeah, having it clear here would be
We
really
we
useful.
have to absolutely have it there, yeah.
Really useful.
So the question, just to clarify, was if signs will be posted?
No, simply, when does the infraction occur? Is it 1 mile an hour over 25, or is it 6 miles an hour over 25? Or like, when does that infraction is incurred?
6 miles.
Because we call it 11 miles for the school zone. I kind of thought it was more like, it was smaller than that, honestly.
I thought it was 6 myself, but yeah.
Yeah.
Let's check on that.
So if we could check on that, what does the state allow us to do and what is the right thing to do, and kind of align that?
So the 11 miles is to double, but fine. It's not,
Right. Because there's 2 conditions, right? It's either your second or greater offense, or it's going that much over the speed limit.
Okay. So your first offense can be doubled if you exceed it by such an amount.
Exactly.
Got it.
so an action item is to go back, review it to see.
Yes, I think we were just bringing it forward, so the council's aware. that This is the.
This is coming forward and it,
Next
Um,
week.
A lot
And
of
it-
people ask about these things, though. They're, the council's gotten specific questions as to what these details are.
we were trying to get the information to you as quickly as possible, and honestly, the anticipation was that city administrator was gonna be here to assist on this one. So,
Another thing that I wanted to ask is that there, some still like a 1-page informational that could be available to people. That, I mean, it is there, but maybe a cheat sheet for somebody, because it'd be great to just shoot those off to
like a
people,
brochure.
like a brochure, or maybe even put it out in a bulletin with explanations, because I think that if they understand, okay, well, HB 2381 actually brought this up, then it takes some of the heat off.
Got it.
So next week is that our first touch, second touch? When are you hoping to get action on this?
Second,
This is our first.
Right. But it sounds like that there are some clarifications that we need to go through with.
The details. And then a question for those that may know, if we're adding front or rear of a motor vehicle, is that a new part of the law that allows that? I felt like that there was something about not photographing faces, like from the front, and then that was something about a privacy sort of thing. I may be mistaken.
They don't require a front license plate, so if they're
It requires a front license plate, just not front tabs. Yeah,
You are subject to. I don't know there.
so yeah, it requires a front license plate, just not front tabs, but I thought we weren't allowed to get a frontal view of a car because of the privacy issue, but I see it here, so I'm curious if it's a change in state law, like where did that come from? And maybe that's a clarification, and
Councilmember Blake.
Frank has.
I pulled up the bill 2384, and that language is pretty much verbatim from the bill itself.
Thank you. Thank you. No challenge, I'm just curious where it came from.
In fact, I'm sorry.
I was just,
Councilmember
Yeah,
Kirkland.
there isn't it?
Yeah, let's see, the new section in the, we have a copy of 2384 in the packet.
I forgot about that.
Yeah, in section 1, sub 8. It does basically literally state, image must not reveal the face of the driver or of the passengers of the vehicle, so there are protections against that.
Perfect, okay.
Yeah.
So we've included in this the transport group memo. Did you intend that just for our information to read it, or is there anything you want to present about it?
I wasn't,
Okay.
Councilmember Proton.
So, thanks, Chair Legal. And the reason that the transpo groups, and also the Vera Mobility memos are included is because, you know, some of the information here may be relevant to understanding why we're changing the fine structure. And part of it is because, of course, we're so concerned about pedestrian safety and the multimodal safety there, especially in that school zone, that even with the school zone cameras operating only during school hours, we're seeing, you know, excessive speeds. And I think to answer one of Councilmember Finn's questions on page 35 of the packet, there's literally a time breakdown of basically what these citations are occurring. And the fact is that it doesn't matter almost what time of day or night we're talking about this. So the justification for increasing the fines is to really discourage people from going so fast on it. Now, the one thing that's really kind of a neat piece of data for me is that the recidivism rate is only 9% in that area, meaning that 91% of the drivers basically get their first ticket and then they don't do it again. And I think, you know, if we could keep on that trend, that would be amazing, because that's one of the reasons I didn't want to forecast the revenue, right? Because the goal is to get that to zero, right? Literally to zero.
Change the behavior.
Yeah, change the behavior. So the point is that, I think, well, one of the reasons we included all this information so that everybody could take a look and see that, for instance, another question that was brought up was how many citations, and on page 41 of the packet in the verifiability part, there's literally basically each of the traffic safety cameras that we have, LF01 to LF14, and whether they're red light or they're speed cameras, and the number of citations that each issues. And so grossly speaking, we can take our traffic safety camera revenue divided by the total number here, right? And get kind of an average. But again, it's kind of dicey, right? Because basically you don't, you know, if the goal is to get it to zero and we give the municipal court a lot of authority in setting the actual fine that's charged, it's very, very hard to basically predict revenue based off of that. So that's one of the reasons why we included this information, just to show why it's so hard to give numbers like that.
And I think that,
Councilmember Riddle.
I think the biggest thing that is gonna be hard for predicting is the increased traffic when Sound Transit opens at the end of August. I think we're gonna see a very different environment in July and August than we will in September and October, as new individuals are coming through and changing their behavior as they receive a ticket, and then they change their behavior and don't receive a second one. But there's gonna be some change there.
Thank you. Councilman.
Oh, yeah, I agree with that. I see fast through traffic now, when I go up. They just line through up, by the Peruvian consulate and go up. They're just right along the cemetery. They're just whipping around. So there might be new people. I mean, that, you know what I'm saying? You want it to be zero, but you're always gonna have new people that are coming through that are not Lake Forest Park residents anyway, so they're probably.
Director Vaughn, did you have anything else to add? Any other comments from council members or?
I just wanted to point out that the updated code that we're changing is going from this basic, it's like 2 sentences to
Much more robust.
yes, more robust. So
The hour is 7:48. We've run long. I appreciate your patience. With that, though, if there's no other comments or discussion, we are adjourned.
Thank you, Chair.
So,